it's Transport 101 that we don't need transport. We need the services that transport gives us. So we want to visit friends, we want to get to school. And it's getting to the school and seeing your friends or shopping that's important. It's not the transport. So if all of that was next door to you, we wouldn't need any transport. So why are people traveling? The government did a 2003 household travel survey. Within the households that they surveyed, out of the total members of the household, these are the percentage of those people saying, this is why I'm traveling. So interesting to me was that traveling to work is the least. And most of the trips are for educational purposes, kids getting to school. One of the reasons why work is the least is because not everybody's privileged enough to be working. So there are a lot of people who are not traveling to work. This is irrespective of the mode. So this includes people walking. It's not just people in vehicles. And that raises a big issue that we are trying to work with in the project, which is that we're not just looking at this from a sort of technical, what fuels are people using, what vehicles, how many buses should we buy in the country and so on, but we're also looking very much at the issues of social equity. So we have developmental challenges in this country, and we have, a vast gap between rich and poor and huge equity challenges. There's a lot of literature around something called transport poverty, and it's really about what you have access to. And the fact that people who don't have those kinds of accesses suffer from social exclusion. So you can't participate actively in the life of the community. You can't get to work or look for work. And all of those things impact on your participation in society. So how are people getting to work? So the train, bus, and taxi are all called public transport, although, of course, taxis are privately owned, so they're not actually public. And then some people are riding in cars, others are walking, that's the green, and then there's various other ways, like bicycles. So look how many people are going by car. Quite a lot of us, considering that very many people can't always afford one. So that, again, reflects, who is going to work. So one of the big problems in South Africa is that if you want to reduce our greenhouse gases from commuter and passenger transport, we've got to get out of our cars. So that's really difficult to change people's behavior, and given that the public transport options are not necessarily delivering a quality of service that many of us would like to see. Who is traveling by what mode according to income group? 65% of people who are somewhat wealthier go to work by car. What's interesting to me is even if you're only earning between 2,000 and 3,000 rand, the minute you can, you get in a car. It's the first big purchase that anyone who sort of lifts themselves out of even the most basic poverty make. Partly because it does offer you flexibility, reach, access, and partly because in our country it's an enormous status symbol. Then the next thing that strikes one is look at the poorest people they're walking. That is in rural and urban areas. So in some of it is because if you're living in the rural areas, very often your work is where you live if you're on the farm. If you're earning up to 500 Rand a month, you almost have no other choice. Otherwise, what would you eat? And then the vast majority of poorer people are going by taxi. Okay, so how much time are we spending getting to work? And the numbers are there. So if you're using public transport, it takes you time to get to that service even before you start your travel time. And that's an avoided time that if you have your own car, you don't have to get anywhere first, you just jump in it. And that introduces a concept called time poverty. The people who are spending the longest time traveling are mostly poor black people, partly because of the spatial planning that we've inherited from apartheid. You have people living way out of the economic centers and the center of town who are having to travel the furthest in. And we haven't managed since '94 to radically shift any of that kind of urban landscape. And we've continued to reproduce it, actually, because all our low-cost housing is being built far from places. What are people spending on this transport? The poorest people are spending 35% of their income on transport. So if you look at the 3,000 plus, we are only spending about 5% of our income on transport. That might be a bigger number than the poorest people. You know, it's our car repayments, cost of petrol, that kind of thing. Parking, it's a lot. But as a proportion of our income, it's very small. So, I mean, if you're only earning 500 Rand and you're spending over a third of it on transport, this is part of why people give up looking for work. Because they, you know, if you don't have an income, it just becomes harder and harder to afford the transport to get to the interviews and to search for work. This is from a CSIR study. They tried to quantify in Rand value some of the externalities of transport. So Milton Friedman defined an externality as when two parties transact, it's an impact on a third party who's not involved. So it's a very clear example is acid mine drainage, where you and I as taxpayers are now picking up the bill for cleaning up the water that the company didn't do. The company didn't spend that money then. So, I mean, those are big numbers. If one looks at the area that we work around for the emissions of carbon dioxide, which is one of the big greenhouse gases, 6.5 billion Rand are from the impacts of those emissions in society that we're picking up the cost for. Somebody is, the economy is. And we talk about a kinetic elite and a kinetic underclass. So these very interesting social and environmental dimensions when you start to unpack what sounds like a very technical area like transport. So our work we frame within this concept of a flourishing South Africa, meaning we've got to, while we try and reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, we've got to do that in such a way that we add to the developmental goals and we improve equity in the country. And these are the kinds of initiatives you do in transport: reduce, shift, improve. So in WWF, we're looking at something called an employee trip reduction program. How do you reduce the number of trips and the impact of those trips from people getting to work? So to come back to the question on the agenda, I think Dion really laid the basis for the answer. We're clearly trying to look at how do we mitigate against climate change. In South Africa, transport is the third largest contributor to our greenhouse gas emissions, but it's the biggest growing sector. So it really is one of those key points that we can intervene at. And where there's interventions that one can do from sort of huge infrastructure and more smaller expenditures targeted to the right things by government, but down to our own personal behaviors. And please get out of your 4x4s.